Some people just want to watch the world burn, even if there's nothing that can be done to pick it back up when they're done. Death of a Wish is a hack-and-slash action RPG with a unique presentation style that came out on March 11th, 2024 for the price of $19.99. Yes, I know I'm a little late to the party on this one, but hear me out. The game is developed by Me3 and has you battling the forces of Neo Sanctum, which sounds like some cross between The Matrix and... Actually, it just sounds like The Matrix. You can find the game on the Nintendo Switch and the PC, and for this review, I played the Steam version, streaming most of my playthrough over on Twitch. The game has gotten high praise from outlets like Rock Paper Shotgun, but will it stand up to a close inspection from my eyes? Or will the scribbles on screen just stay as scribbles? Let's find out, shall we? You play as Christian, who is on a mission to take down the cult that ended up raising him, which includes father, sister, cardinal, and priest. The name may be a bit on the nose in terms of possible symbolism, but Christian regardless wants to take all of them down, as they've dominated Neo Sanctum and the people in this dystopian future. We'll get more into Christian and the story later on in the video, but I want to start with the meat at the core of the game, the action combat and the gameplay. On the surface, Death of a Wish is an action RPG with the basics that you would expect from its controls. You've got a basic light attack and basic heavy attack, which can be held down for more substantial versions of whatever aria you've got equipped. Arias are basically an attack set with basic rules and strengths. Anima, for example, focuses on close quarters combat and bleeding an enemy over time, while Thanatos goes for crushing blows and incredible aggression. At a certain point, you can equip one of the arias as a sub-equipment for the other, leading to interesting combinations to experiment with. In addition, you'll also get a familiar that acts as a ranged option, whether it's a series of small bullets or one giant rail shot. As for your defensive options, it's all about the dodge here. You've got a dodge with a small cooldown that will move you across the field fast, but it's the timing of that dodge that's important. Dodge at the right time and you'll parry an attack. Granted, you have to be going in the direction the attack is coming, or at least opposite from it, but it's huge for breaking an enemy. When an enemy is broken, it basically stuns the enemy for a small period of time, allowing you to put together as much offense and a beatdown as you can during it. This will be the bread and butter of how you get enemies damaged, and while attacks can work their way to that stunned state somewhat, it's timing these parries with enemy attacks that will really push you over the edge. Which synergizes nicely with Death of a Wish's unique gimmick, the rewind function. Of course you've seen rewind in games like Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, but Death of a Wish isn't slowing time down and rewinding it. It's creating a point to restart from. See, if you get into trouble where you're going to die in battle, you do have the ability to recover health with a typical health potion of sorts, but they are small in number. What you'll have a lot more of is the ability to rewind to the start of the fight, for both you and your opponent. Whatever health you had at the start of the fight, you now have it back, but so does your opponent, which in most cases is going to be full. Which may not sound like that's helpful at all. I mean, isn't it just going back to a literal save point and you could just, reload from a save? Well, it's not that simple, and actually is a management game within the game of sorts. Sure, if this is the first fight after a save point, and I'm at 25% health about to die from a hit, and the multiple enemies are at 90% health in total, that's a no-brainer to restart with. But what about if I'm at 50% health? I mean, I could definitely finish the battle at all, but I would be going into the next battle limping even if I kept that 50% up. What happens if I'm facing a boss who's at 25% health, who I've been struggling with, and I'm only at 10%? Do I say, alright, I rewind despite having gotten him that low? Or do I risk it and hope I take him out? Does it matter how many rewinds I have? Maybe I do if I have like 7, but if I'm at 3, maybe I take the risk. The game's combat also pairs well with the rewind system when you start getting into the nitty-gritty of the combat as well. Enemies have very specific movement patterns and strategies to deal with them optimally, which can be really trained by the repetition of facing enemies very quickly in a row, like restarting a battle would do. You get to learn the enemy's strengths and weaknesses just from fighting and knowing how to engage with them without taking massive shots of health in the process. Now, I'm not exactly sure 100% on this next point, but it does feel like there's a critical distance in which damage has some sort of multiplier when it comes to hitting you in terms of damage, as some basic enemies can literally get you down to critical health in one hit. Now, maybe it's a weakness or some other element that's playing into it, like the elemental types, but I learned what I thought was a better strategy to deal with them by fighting them over and over again in rapid succession, and learning from what was working and what didn't. What surprises me, however, is that you'd think that repetition would also lead to its own problems, with things getting a little bit too, well, repetitive and boring because of it. But Death of a Wish knew enough in how it stretched over its save points and its enemy types to make it so that it wasn't that big of a deal. You either were facing new enemies or different scenarios, or the fact is that you were able to overcome the challenge and face your next one very quickly. I didn't feel like the game was dragging on in specific scenarios in combat at any point, which is surprising to me. However, it did drag in one specific aspect. There's an interesting twist to this problem, however. See, if you're cycling through good and bad combat, where you're learning and dealing with problems and causing variety, that's going to keep the enjoyment up. But what happens when you get into that groove of doing well over and over again? Sure, some games you do want to get the best rating that you can get or do the best that you can, but at a certain point it starts to get repetitive. Is it possible that the game starts to wear on you because of it, specifically here? Well, funny enough, Death of a Wish sorta handles this scenario with another mechanic: the corruption meter. The game does have a rating system that mirrors games like Devil May Cry, where after battle, it rewards you with a rating of how well you fought. But here's the difference in this implementation. As you die or take damage, your corruption will go up. There are scenarios in the game that suggest that going over 100% corruption has consequences, and it is something that you'll want to keep an eye on, especially for the ending of the game. But doing well in battle can reduce that corruption meter. Battle perfectly, for example, and it'll take a chunk off of it at once, which makes you feel good and actually makes you want to fight at the best of your abilities every single time, which leads to the repetition. The fact is, if you keep on getting good fights and battling perfectly, that corruption meter will go down and down and down and give you a story reason to keep going. So, funny enough, it helps itself in that aspect. See, that's sort of the weird thing about Death of the Wish and the way they pulled things together. It felt like every action in battle had consequences and effects that were somehow positive in the big picture, which, I'm going to be honest, surprised me. Like, take the boss battles, for example. There are some challenging bosses in this game, and sometimes they can absolutely run you over in the first few attempts, and you get better, you try it again and again, you see the corruption go up, but you are having fun and trying to get over the challenge. But there were also bosses that I absolutely annihilated, and you'd think that would bother me, that they would have felt underpowered in the big picture. And yet, usually it was, yeah, there goes the corruption percentage, bye-bye now, I get less corrupted. And that surprised me on how effective that was. I'm impressed that the combat never got old for me, and the ability to mix things up with different weapon types and explore around and try new things did really help the game consistently bring enjoyment. I will say, however, outside of combat, the game's gameplay does have some flaws in it. Exploring the world is pretty straightforward, like you would expect in an action RPG, but the simple nature of the map, with the lack of quest markers or anything of the sort, did start to wear on me in the last third of the game. Now, I'll openly admit, it is entirely possible that the story and or text gave me the location of where to go specifically, and I just completely missed it. But I did find myself wandering endlessly in the world towards the end, even though I wanted to face the final battle, and it felt like the game could have helped me in the area just a little bit. I also wish the game had more side content, or at least content off the beaten path. Sure, there are things like the memories in the game to collect, but I wanted more sub-stories that gave me a little bit more of the world's secondary stories and not necessarily connected to Christian's direct path of destruction. Not to say that the game doesn't have enough content in the big picture. The game can take 5 to 7 hours to beat, and honestly, it didn't extend itself needlessly. But I feel like I wanted more from a story perspective, which I will get to in a little bit. Switching gears, let's talk about the presentation, which may be the most obvious and yet overlooked aspect of the game. I say obvious because it's a presentation style that is striking and what drew me to the game in the first place. The fact is, the game looks like it was drawn by a 6-year-old child with a blackboard and colored chalk. And yet, it's somehow fascinating how well the presentation works in conjunction with the story at play here. Remember, we're playing from the perspective of someone who was in a cult, someone who has a very distorted view of the world, despite coming to his senses in the end. If you look closely at the details in the drawings, for example, you'll notice that they're all over the place. Sometimes you can easily identify what you're looking at. A school bus, a cactus, a trash can. Sometimes it may have simple details, like the scarf that Christian wears, but not a lot of detail beyond that. But then there's some things that aren't so obvious when you look at them. And I think that's purposeful beyond the potential skill of the artist present here. Almost like that the memory of those questionable items don't have as much detail because of where the perspective is coming from, aka Christian. Maybe he remembers certain things, like certain elements of a character because they stood out to him, but maybe not other parts of them. It plays to the unreliable narrator trope that I think is present in the story, where you do question exactly if what is going on is truly a representation of what happened, or maybe it's distorted a little bit. The scratchy nature of the presentation plays into this, like it was filled in very quickly and maybe not correctly. Quite frankly, it's indicative of the idea that you can't judge a game by a screenshot or an image alone. This presentation is purposeful and for a reason, and I like how it's integrated into the game. I like the use of color and more subdued tones in the environment, and I like how the images sort of stick out to me in uncommon ways. The downside of the presentation, however, is that in action, it can be a little bit hard to quantify exactly what's going on. The attacks and colors are able to be seen in motion and all, but when you get multiple effects and multiple colors in a small area, it all jumbles into what I want to quantify as a rainbow being dragged through a cheese grater. Or a tie-dye machine, that's probably a better analogy. One of the two, at least. It actually means you're more relying on moving yourself to actually see more of what's happening by causing one-on-one situations. Which could be the point here, but honestly, it's not a game that you're going to be able to stream easily without compression algorithms at times vomiting out things that probably aren't going to look great. I do want to point out that character designs somehow get personality traits across despite the lack of detail, like the smugness of this character. Granted, you don't get a lot of that, but it was surprising to say the least. As for sound design, it's crunchy in a good way. When enemies do strong strikes, for example, it's very easy to hear and it doesn't blend into the background. It pops like it should. You firing off a series of bullets are less loud and pointed, but still be able to be heard. It all feels like it's on the right audio levels, despite the audio itself at times being, well, not to say non-representative of what you're doing, it just sounds at times that I didn't expect. The sound of a pong ball kept coming into my head in certain fights, and I don't think that was the intended effect. But rely on this sound to give you audio clues better than many games in the genre, because it's clear when you do something right or what you need to avoid. Take a listen and you'll hear what I'm talking about. The music, on the other hand, I feel like I've had my brain removed while trying to analyze the music with this game. I'm gonna be honest with you. Like, it's weird. The music has energy that it needs during the combat, and can lead to some good moments in the story with haunting melodies and the right use of instruments. The music itself isn't necessarily something that you'd bop to outside the game, but feels appropriate for in the game as background noise. But at the same time, I didn't get the theming and the synergy that I was hoping from with the story, which is weird when I pair that with the presentation that did that so well. I was expecting the fights of people like the Cardinal to have more religious undertones or angelic elements to it, and I didn't hear them. It feels like it was done by a different person with a different vision of the game. I don't know how to quantify that 100%, and I've struggled to sort of put this paragraph together. What I will say is that when I played the game with other music on, I surprisingly had problems in combat at that point. It was sort of weird, to be honest with you. It's like the music does complement the game and doesn't get in the way of the sound design, and yet it doesn't complement the game at the same time? Listen, I admit, I'm not a musical expert, or hell, even someone who knows exactly what they are talking about when coming to music theory. But take a listen and maybe hear what I'm saying, or at least what I'm trying to say. Just take a listen. Finally, let's talk about the story, which is the element that I think I struggled with in this review the most when it came to sitting down and gathering my thoughts on what I had played. The story takes an interesting angle on the whole saving the world thing, that a fight to destroy a giant evil may destroy you and your hopes along the way. It's clear as the game progresses that Christian is not your typical hero, and not easily established as an anti-hero either. He obviously cares about the pain and problems that he causes, but at the same time doesn't seem to be as bothered by what he has done that he should be. It's weird. The funny thing is, if I think about the character that reminds me most of Christian in this game, it's Griffith from Berserk of all things. Which is insanity considering what that character does in that story. And yet I sit here and look at Christian, who is supposed to be the main hero, and that's the best I can do off the top of my head. It's clear that the other major characters on your side are supposed to leave an impression on you, and they definitely do. The story in my mind is more about those characters than Christian himself, and the cult itself as well, as they definitely leave more of an impression more than anything else. Those sub-stories are what I will remember most about the game, and the trauma those characters undergo. In fact, I will warn players, if you're in a spot where you're vulnerable to painful imagery or just don't like complicated topics right now, I would advise to wait until you're in a better state before tackling the game. In addition, I will say, unlike the combat of the game, the pacing of the story is one of the weakest parts of the game. It feels like it's a first-time driver in a driver's ed class, not knowing how much to push the gas from second to second. Even though the conversation and story elements can be straightforward, it can be sort of surprising how quickly something resolves itself, then followed by something that seems to drag on a lot longer than it feels like it should. I feel like the story may have had elements cut out for the sake of the pacing of the gameplay, so that things didn't feel too repetitive and or didn't have the resources to finish parts of the story. I don't know exactly why on that second part, but it feels like there were a lot of cuts made. The thing is, there's definitely great set pieces in the game, and there's little world building elements that do work. But I feel like there could have been a really top tier story that could have been built here, but it ended up missing the target. Honestly, the biggest part of that is that the cult itself. For a game that is centered around the idea of the cult and taking it down and what they do and being so involved in the story, I'm not exactly sure what the cult is. I know the parts and what they've done, but I feel like I'm missing a layer of the storytelling with it, and that was consistent throughout the game. Especially the main characters, the things like the Cardinal. It feels like they should be a little bit more centered on in the story, and yet they weren't. And yet, I enjoyed a lot of Death of a Wish had to offer, especially with how refined the combat system was and its unique elements playing into the overall picture. I like how the game dared to be different in a sea of games trying to mirror other game successes, and it made the game feel like something you should play that much more because of it. Remember, my scoring system is a buyability score more than anything. It's designed to tell you whether to buy a game right now or later on, and one of the things that really comes into play is a game's unique position compared to other games. That's the thing about Death of a Wish. Sure, there are more complex combat systems out there and better graphically fidelity games, but the moments within Death of a Wish, the challenges, they felt like a breath of fresh air in the genre. The fact is that this game will stick with me a lot more than others thanks to all its unique quirks, and that makes a difference. It's why it gets a 91 out of 100, which may surprise many out there because of my complaints about the story and other elements, but it does enough to grab your attention with its set pieces, its complex characters, and its presentation and combat staying with you. It's worth buying right now, even if you're hurting for cash. Just a little bit on the lower end of that. But that doesn't take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective elements of games and tries to match a game to you. If you fall into one of the following categories on screen, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game lies in the buyability rating for you. Now, in this case, there's a lot more subjectivity because of some of the unique elements that this game has. So, the game is not going to be for everyone. There are going to be players that are going to need to avoid the game. But, in general, Death of a Wish is something that I want to see more of in the industry. Something that challenges itself to be a little different, to try something new, and really puts the effort into making that a reality. That's it for this review. I know that this review was a little bit longer in terms of when it came out compared to my last one. I thought I would be able to get this done very quickly after the last review, but the fact of the matter is that I had writer's block. This game was an interesting challenge in terms of putting my thoughts onto paper because of how unique it was compared to others, and I had to really think about what the game did well and what the game struggled with. And when I finally came out of my writer's block, it just all hit the page at once. It's a little bit strange. Regardless, if you want to see more reviews like this, hit the subscribe button, and if you like this video, hit that like button, and maybe share it with a friend or two. Coming up next on the channel will be a review of Crystal Comet. It is a sort of top-down shooter with multiplayer elements. The fact is, I did receive a key for that, which has been a little bit of a challenge lately. There have been a lot more scammers out there requesting keys, and smaller indies, medium indies have been less likely to give keys out, even for people who have a history of, providing reviews. It's a sad state, but what can you do? I'm still working on the Parasite Eve review as I speak into this mic right now. To the right of me is the PS2 version playing and being in the Chrysler building still, because goddamn, the Chrysler building is something. Anyway, join the Discord if you want to hear updates on a more regular basis, but that's it for now, and as always, keep on gaming.